It is so good to be here, and I thank Rabbi Friedman for inviting me, Rabbi Pleasant. And when I asked Rabbi Friedman how long I had to speak, he said, well, I usually speak 15 minutes. And I said, I can't clear my throat in 15 minutes. Can I have 20? So I hope you'll forgive me for going over a little bit. As we gather here on this Erev Shabbat, Israel is once again at war. This time partnering with the United States, and I will leave it to others to discern what motivated President Trump to join with Israel in attacking Iran. As for Israel, the simplest explanation for her involvement is 47 years of constant threats of annihilation from Iran's leadership and from Iran's willing partners, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Syria, all of whom are weakened or gone. The willingness of the United States to become involved and some amazing intelligence made it possible for Israel to lessen this 47-year-old threat. The outcome of this war is yet to be determined, and I will leave it to others far more knowledgeable than I to provide the commentary. I almost decided not to give this sermon tonight because I am somewhat critical at the moment of things that Israel is doing, both internally and externally. But I realize that what I'm going to talk about now will still be there when this war ends. But in the meantime, our prayers are with all of those innocents who are dying during this war, most of whom who had nothing to do with what their governments are doing. Tonight I want to reflect on my struggle with what it means to be a Zionist in 26. I wish it were 2016. And I want to share with you some thoughts about Israel and American Jewry. I say struggle because the Israel I have known, the Israel I have been involved with, is not the Israel of today. And I struggled with what I would say tonight. And I hesitate, as I said, to be critical. But I need to share with you some of my thoughts. For those of you who do not know me, a bit about me and my involvement with Israel. I think it fair to say that Israel has been at the center of my Jewish and professional life. Israel has been my spiritual home. And I have viewed Israel as the fulfillment of the Zionist dream to establish a home for Jews that will allow them to live in safety. Fairly early in my rabbinate, I became a member of the National UJA Rabbinic Cabinet and led many missions to Israel. I became chair of the Reform Movement's Commission on Jewish Education and worked with the movement's professional educators to develop an Israel curriculum. I became a member of ARTSA, the Reform Movement's Zionist organization, and was honored to serve as the organization's president for 2 years and to work on behalf of our movement to move Israel toward becoming a more democratic and pluralistic state, which for me meant recognizing the legitimacy of Reform Judaism and respecting the rights of all who live there. Alas, we have yet to accomplish these tasks. And alas, Israel today is not the Israel I had come to know. Perhaps my loyalty was to an imagined Israel. I don't know. What I do know is that increasingly my struggles with modern-day Israel often center on the tension between supporting a Jewish homeland and opposing some of its policies regarding security, the treatment of Palestinians, and the occupation of the West Bank. I grapple with reconciling Jewish values of justice with extremist violence, the erosion of democratic ideals, and the ongoing complex conflict that leaves little room for a peaceful two-state solution. I am deeply concerned about the impact of Israeli military actions and policies on Palestinian lives, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. This includes navigating the moral implications of the occupation, of settler violence, and restricted freedom of movement for Palestinians. I worry about the rise of extremist, nationalist, and religious right-wing influences that threaten to undermine the country's foundations as a democratic, inclusive state. Benjamin Netanyahu has been Israel's prime minister for 19 years and is on trial for corruption and other charges, has surrounded himself with right-wing politicians who are responsible for the very things I am most worried about. I worry about the growing dangers faced by the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Palestinian citizens who make up about 20% of the population of Israel are being killed daily in crime-related killings. Itamar Ben-Gvir, a man with a criminal record of incitement to racism against Palestinians, is in charge of the police and has withdrawn police officers from Palestinian communities. I worry about what will happen if Israel does not find a way to draft ultra-Orthodox young men so that the burden of defense can be shared. I am not sure how much longer the non-Orthodox population will tolerate sending their children off to war when a growing percentage of the population refuses to serve. More and more, a fundamental struggle is balancing Israel's legitimate security needs and the trauma of attacks such as on October 7th, with the desire to end the long-term damaging occupation of Palestinian territories. I worry that in our country, in the United States, Israel has become a political football. More and more Americans have negative views concerning Israel, and our political parties are more and more talking about withholding military funding. All of this ultimately is bad for Israel and increasingly bad for the American Jewish community. The dramatic rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and elsewhere is not an accident, given negative views of Israel. And as American Jews have become more and more critical themselves, politicians are more and more asking why they should continue supporting the Jewish state if their Jewish constituents are no longer doing so. For many Jews, especially younger Jews in the diaspora, there is a painful conflict between their love for the land and people of Israel and their opposition to its government's actions, which leads to silence or a reluctance to speak out, or worse. During the last 20 years or so, while the so-called Jewish defense organizations and AIPAC made support of Israel central to their work, a younger generation of Jews have been moving in a different direction. The continued occupation by Israel of the West Bank and the rightward turn of Israel's politics is seen by younger Jews as contrary to what they believed and experienced. After all, we older liberal American Jews have raised our children to love thy neighbor. We have taught our kids to respect the dignity of every human being. And so they ask, doesn't this apply to the Palestinians as well? And at the same time, we adults have been conflicted ourselves, seeing the dominance of the religious right in Israel and not knowing how to have informed conversations with activist friends and fellow students. Our children and grandchildren have become less and less identified with Israel, and in many cases, sadly, with Judaism itself. On October 7th, 2023, on the morning of Simchat Torah, we awoke to the news that Hamas had invaded Israel, raping, killing, and pillaging, and taking hostages back to Gaza. How could this happen? We wondered. Why was Israel so ill-prepared? Where was the army? Why didn't the Mossad and the Shin Bet know an attack was imminent? In those early days, before Israel's massive invasion of the Gaza Strip began, the responses of some on the U.S. left shocked me. It turned out that people who see themselves as defenders of human rights, who had supported and justified Hamas's unspeakable acts. Progressive writers declared glory to the Hamas fighters, or proclaimed October 7th a day of celebration. Lawyers who made their careers criticizing Israel's violations of international law twisted themselves in defense of Hamas's war crimes. Yet looking back, perhaps I should not have been surprised. Although I had only allowed myself to admit such fears in the dark of a sleepless night, I had long dreaded a moment like this. Before October 7th, reports out of Israel made it clear that the situation there was already volatile. The Israeli army had killed more Palestinians in 2022 than in any year since the Second Intifada. Settler violence displaced entire villages in the area of the South Hebron Hills, while in Palestinian towns, radical hilltop youths carried out a series of vicious pogroms. New groups of young Palestinian militants, unaffiliated with any political faction, were carrying out bold shooting attacks on Israeli settlers and checkpoints. An explosion seemed just around the corner. Like most observers, even Israeli military intelligence, I assumed that when everything ignited, the epicenter would be the West Bank. Fatally, Gaza was an afterthought. There seemed to be a high probability that sooner or later a mass casualty event would claim the lives of dozens, maybe even hundreds of Israelis. That was the scale on which before October 7th we measured such things. I imagined it would resemble the terrorist attacks of the Second Intifada. But I knew that whatever form this looming attack took, when the bomb went off, the Jewish left, and I among them, would face a serious test. For reasons of moral integrity and political strategy, we would need to find a way to oppose the killing of innocent Israeli civilians, to mourn with our Jewish families, and at the same time remain resolute in our opposition to Israel's occupation and prepare to protest what could be the Israeli army's disproportionate and devastating response. We would need to do this even if it meant angering the Palestinian activists, who would see any grief for dead Israelis as politically unacceptable, and even if it meant angering those on the left who believe that any action taken in an anti-colonial struggle, no matter how ghastly its civilian toll, is justified. The alternative would mean severing the ties between the political left and the people in whose name they spoke. To refuse to mourn the deaths of Israeli Jews as Jews would in effect mean denying their membership in the broader Jewish people, the plurality of whom now live in Israel. It would be an untenable, even perverse kind of disavowal. How could we continue to speak out about all the things I mentioned a few moments ago and at the same time grieve for our fellow Jews? On October 7th and the days that followed, a vocal segment of the Jewish left did exactly the opposite, and they failed the test. Because to refuse to mourn the death of Israeli Jews as Jews would in effect mean denying membership in the broader Jewish people. It would be an untenable, even perverse act. If the United States left failed morally on October 7th, against this backdrop of mounting horror, the organized American Jewish community has failed even more spectacularly. It had grown indifferent to Palestinian suffering over years of unequivocal support for Israeli government policies. After the gruesome Hamas-led attack, its dehumanization of Palestinians had reached new heights. Prominent American Jewish leaders, among them the self-professed liberals, were now asserting that there is no amount of death that might lead them to reconsider the justness of the war and call for the fighting to continue indefinitely. Jewish establishment figures have thrown their weight behind hysterical attempts to censor and expel advocates for Palestinian rights from the United States public sphere, further fueling a culture war that was already at a fever pitch. They have instrumentalized accusations of anti-Semitism in ugly public spectacles, making the fight against real and resurgent anti-Semitism in U.S. politics even more difficult. But what the American Jewish establishment fails to understand is that far more than Hamas's rockets or left-wing pro-Palestinians on U.S. campuses, the real threat to Israel's survival is a return to the undemocratic one-state reality. The October 7th attacks prove that continued occupation is unsustainable and guarantees only the loss of future lives. With Israel increasingly isolated on the world stage, maintaining the occupation also risks burning whatever shred of international legitimacy Israel has left. Ending military rule in the West Bank and the siege of Gaza is necessary, not just because Palestinians deserve to live with freedom and dignity. It is also necessary because it is the only way Israelis will not be forced to live forever by the sword. At the same time, the low hum of ambient anti-Semitism seems to grow steadily louder. Famous racial justice activists tweet to their hundreds of thousands of followers about the danger of, quote, Zionist doctors, and the alleged connection between Jeffrey Epstein and the Gaza war. You figure out that one. As a Jew and as a progressive, I often feel closed in from both sides, pinched between great shame and great fear. I am infuriated by the crimes of the state that acts in the name of the Jewish people, and more worried than I have ever been by the rising acceptability of conspiratorial thinking and the demonization of Jews. It often feels like an impossible place, but it is the place that we must hold. I understand my friends and former colleagues who wish to renounce Israel with finality and disavow any connection between their Jewish identity and the Jewish state. Yet I believe that doing so is both a moral and political mistake, because the power of our protest grows from our connection. And while Israel and Zionism are not the sum total of Jewishness and Judaism, thinking and acting Jewishly also requires recognizing that Israel, more than any other place, is where Jews live. To change our people, we must be with them. That is our responsibility. To me, that is what it means to be a Zionist. Not necessarily to agree with or support policies we disagree with, or worse, but to join the fight of those who believe that the only Jewish homeland is worthy of our support. I can no more give up on Israel than I can give up on the United States. And so I will, to the best of my ability, join with those who continue to fight for a democratic and pluralistic Israel. I will continue to pray for peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians both. Shalom al Yisrael. Amen.